barrels.
This is Audible.
Recorded Books presents, in partnership with HarperCollins UK, The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, by J.R.R. Tolkien. Read by Andy Serkis. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with panelled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on and on, going fairly, but not quite, straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as all the people for many miles round called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then on another. No going upstairs for the hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these. Wardrobes. He had whole rooms devoted to clothes. Kitchens, dining rooms, all were on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. The best rooms were all on the left-hand side going in, for these were the only ones to have windows, deep-set, round windows looking over his garden and meadows beyond, sloping down to the river. This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighbourhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable. Not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. This is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbours' respect, but he gained, well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular hobbit. What is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some description nowadays, since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are, or were, a little people about half our height and smaller than the bearded dwarfs. Hobbits have no beards. There is little or no magic about them except the ordinary everyday sort which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making a noise like elephants that they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colours, chiefly green and yellow, wear no shoes because their feet grow natural leathery soles and thick warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly, have long clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laugh deep fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now you know enough to go on with. As I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, that is, was the famous Belladonna Took, one of the three remarkable daughters of the old Took, head of the hobbits who lived across the water, the small river that ran at the foot of the hill. It was often said, in other families, that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd, but certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about them. And once in a while, members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. They discreetly disappeared and the family hushed it up, but the fact remained that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, though they were undoubtedly richer. Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money, that was to be found either under the hill or over the hill or across the water, and there they remained to the end of their days. Still, it is probable that Bilbo, her only son, although he looked and behaved exactly like a second edition of his solid and comfortable father, got something a bit queer in his make-up from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins was grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and living in the beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described for you, until he had, in fact, apparently settled down immovably. By some curious chance one morning long ago in the quiet of the world, when there was less noise and more green, and the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous, and Bilbo Baggins was standing at his door after breakfast, smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached down nearly to his woolly toes, neatly brushed, Gandalf came by. Gandalf. If you had heard only a quarter of what I have heard about him, and I've only heard very little of all there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went, in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down that way under the hill for ages and ages, not since his friend the old Took died, in fact, and the hobbits had almost forgotten what he looked like. He had been away over the hill and across the water on businesses of his own since they were all small hobbit boys and hobbit girls. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. He had a tall, pointed blue hat, a long grey cloak, a silver scarf over which his long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. "Good morning," said Bilbo. And he meant it. The sun was shining and the grass was very green, but Gandalf looked at him from under long, bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning, whether I want it or not, or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on?" "All of them at once," said Bilbo, and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors into the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry, we have all the day before us." Then Bilbo sat down on a seat by his door, crossed his legs, and blew out a beautiful grey ring of smoke that sailed up into the air without breaking and floated away over the hill. "Very pretty," said Gandalf, "but I have no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I am looking for someone to share in an adventure that I am arranging, and it's very difficult to find anyone." "I should think so in these parts. We are plain, quiet folk and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things make you late for dinner. I can't think what anybody sees in them," said our Mr. Baggins, and stuck one thumb behind his braces and blew out another, even bigger smoke ring. Then he took out his morning letters and began to read, pretending to take no more notice of the old man. He had decided that he was not quite his sort and wanted him to go away. But the old man did not move. He stood leaning on his stick and gazing at the hobbit without saying anything, till Bilbo got quite uncomfortable and even a little cross. "Good morning," he said at last. "We don't want any adventures here, thank you. You might try over the hill or across the water." By this he meant that the conversation was at an end. "What a lot of things you do use good morning for," said Gandalf. "Now you mean you want to get rid of me, and that it won't be good till I move off." "Not at all, not at all, my dear sir. Let me see. I don't think I know your name." Yes, my dear sir, and I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins. And you do know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. To think that I should have lived to be good morning by Belladonna Took's son, as if I was selling buttons at the door. Gandalf? Gandalf! Good gracious me, not the wandering wizard that gave old Took a pair of magic diamond studs that fastened themselves and never came undone until ordered. Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties about dragons and goblins and giants and the rescue of princesses and the unexpected luck of widows' sons. Not the man that used to make such particularly excellent fireworks. Oh, I remember those. Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve. Splendid. They used to go up like great lilies and snapdragons and laburnums of fire and hang in the twilight all evening. You will notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite so prosy as he liked to believe. Also that he was very fond of flowers. Dear me, he went on. Not the Gandalf who was responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for mad adventures. Anything from climbing trees to visiting elves or sailing in ships, sailing to other shores. Bless me, life used to be quite you used to upset things badly in these parts once upon a time. I beg your pardon, but I had no idea that you were still in business. Where else should I be? Said the wizard. All the same, I am pleased to find you remember something about me. You seem to remember my fireworks kindly, at any rate, and that is not without hope. Indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake, and for the sake of poor Belladonna, I will give you what you asked for. I beg your pardon, I haven't asked for anything. Yes, you have. Twice now. My pardon. I give it to you. In fact, I will go so far as to send you to this adventure. Very amusing for me, very good for you, and profitable too, very likely, if you ever get over it. Oh, sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you, not today. Good morning, but please come to tea any time you like. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye. With that, the hobbit turned and scuttled inside his round green door and shut it as quickly as he dared, not to seem rude. Wizards, after all, are wizards. What on earth did I ask him to tea for? He said to himself as he went to the pantry. He had only just had breakfast, but he thought a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was still standing outside the door and laughing long but quietly. After a while he stepped up, and with the spike on his staff, scratched a queer sign on the hobbit's beautiful green front door. Then he strode away, just about the time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake and beginning to think that he had escaped adventures very well. The next day, he'd almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well unless he put them down on his engagement tablet, like this. Gandalf, tea, Wednesday. Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time, there came a tremendous ring on the front door bell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put the kettle on, and put out another cup and saucer and an extra cake or two, and ran to the door. "Oh, I'm so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside, just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg, and, "Dwarlin, at your service," he said with a low bow. Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I'm just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation? They had not been at the table long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake, when there came another, even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So you have got here at last." That's what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step, with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was opened, just as if he'd been invited. "I see they've begun to arrive already," he said when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it and, "Balin, at your service," he said with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty and stuck to it, however painful he might have to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better, if it's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with the white beard. "But I don't mind some cake, seed cake, if you have any." "Lots," Bilbo found himself answering to his surprise, and he found himself scuttling off too, to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to a pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them when loud came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring. Oh, God, Gandalf for certain this time, he thought as he puffed along the passage, but it was not. It was 2 more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarves?" he said. "Killy, at your service," said the one. "And Filly," added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin here already, I see," said Killy. "Let us join the throng." "Throng," thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just had a sip in the corner while the 4 dwarfs sat round the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous, when ding-dong-a-ling-dang, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "It's some 4, I should say by the sound," said Filly. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened, and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay for supper. Then the bell rang again, louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dorry, Norry, Orry, Owen and Glowin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth, the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were starting on a round of buttered scones when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry and altogether bewildered and bewuthered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in one on top of the other. More dwarfs, 4 more, and there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat and then open the door like a pop gun. Let me introduce Biffa Boffa Bomber, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Biffa Boffa and Bomber, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf. In fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Biffa, Boffa and Bomba on top of him. For one thing, Bomba was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin, indeed, was very haughty and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray, don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that, tea? Oh, no, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Biffa. "And mince pies and cheese," said Boffa. "And pork pie and salad," said Bomba. "And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarves through the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him as the hobbits stumped off to the pantries. "And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." "Seems to know as much about the inside of my larders as I do myself," thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had got all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. "Confustigate and bother these dwarves," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen and Fili and Killy behind them, and before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlour and set everything out afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all round, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure. The dwarves ate and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you will all stay to supper," he said in his politest, unpressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin, "and after, we shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now, to clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on the top, with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright. "Oh, please be careful, and please don't trouble, I can manage." But the dwarves only started to sing. "Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks, that's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat, pour the milk on the pantry floor, leave the bones on the bedroom mat, splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks in a boiling bowl, pound them up with a thumping pole, and when you've finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. So carefully with the plates." And of course they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleaned and put away safe as quick as lightning, while the hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender, smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and wherever he told one to go, it went. Up the chimney, or behind the clock on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings. And then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent up the wind over the hill. "Now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." Killy and Filly rushed for their bags and brought back little fiddles. Dorry, Norry and Orry brought out flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Bomber produced a drum from the hall. Biffer and Boffer went out too and came back with clarinets that they had left among the walking sticks. Dwalin and Balin said, "Excuse me, I left mine in the porch." "Just bring mine in with you," said Thorin. They came back with viols as big as themselves and with Thorin's harp wrapped in a green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it, the music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else, swept away into dark lands under strange moons, far over the water and very far from his hobbit home under the hill. The dark came into the room from the little window that opened in the side of the hill. The firelight flickered. It was April, and still they played on while the shadow of Gandalf's beard wagged against the wall. The dark filled all the room, and the fire died down, and the shadows were lost, and still they played on. And suddenly, first one and then another began to sing as they played, deep-throated singing of the dwarfs in the deep places of their ancient homes. And this is like a fragment of their song, if it can be like their song without their music. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to seek the pale enchanted gold. The dwarves of yore made mighty spells, while hammers fell like ringing bells in places deep where dark things sleep, in hollow halls beneath the fells. For ancient king and elvish lord, there many a gleaming golden hoard they shaped and wrought, and light they caught, to hide in gems on hilt of sword. On silver necklaces they strung the flowering stars, on crowns they hung the dragon fire, in twisted wire they meshed the light of moon and sun. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to claim our long forgotten gold. Goblets they carved there for themselves, and harps of gold where no man delves. There lay their long, and many a song was sung unheard by men or elves. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, its flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light. The bells were ringing in the dale, and men looked up with faces pale, then dragons' ire, more fierce than fire, laid low their towers, and houses frail. The mountain smoked beneath the moon. The dwarves they heard the tramp of doom. They fled their hall to dying fall beneath his feet, beneath the moon. Far over the misty mountains grim, to dungeons deep and caverns dim, we must away ere break of day, to win our harps and gold from him. As they sang, the hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands, and by cunning and by magic moving through him, a fierce and a jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. And then something tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls, and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out of the window. The stars were out in a dark sky above the trees. He thought of the jewels of the dwarves shining in dark caverns. Suddenly, in the wood beyond the water, a flame leapt up, probably someone lighting a wood fire, and he thought of plundering dragons settling on his quiet hill and kindling it all to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was playing Mr. Baggins at Bag End under Hill again. He got up, trembling. He had less than half a mind to fetch the lamp, and more than half a mind to pretend to, and go and hide behind the beer barrels in the cellar and not come out again until all the dwarves had gone away. Suddenly he found that the music and the singing had stopped, and they were all looking at him with eyes shining in the dark. "Where are you going?" said Thorin, in a tone that seemed to show that he guessed both halves of the hobbit's mind. "What about a little light?" said Bilbo apologetically. "We like the dark," said all the dwarves. "Dark for dark business. There are many hours before dawn." "Of course," said Bilbo, and sat down in a hurry. He missed the stool and sat in the fender, knocking over the poker and the shovel with a crash. "Hush!" said Gandalf. "Let Thorin speak." And this is how Thorin began. "Gandalf, dwarves, and Mr. Baggins, we are met together in the house of our friend and fellow conspirator, this most excellent and audacious hobbit. May the hair on his toes never fall out. All praise to his wine and ale." He paused for breath and for a polite remark from the hobbit, but the compliments were quite lost on poor Bilbo Baggins, who was wagging his mouth in protest at being called audacious and, worst of all, fellow conspirator, though no noise came out. He was so flummoxed. So Thorin went on. "We are met to discuss our plans, our ways, means, policy, and devices. We shall soon, before the break of day, start on our long journey. A journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, except our friend and counsellor, the ingenious wizard Gandalf, may never return. It is a solemn moment. Our object is, I take it, well known to us all. To the estimable Mr. Baggins, and perhaps to one or two of the younger dwarves, I think I should be right in naming Killy and Philly, for instance, the exact situation at the moment may require a little brief explanation." This was Thorin's style. He was an important dwarf. If he'd been allowed, he probably would have gone on like this until he was out of breath, without telling anyone there anything that was not known already. But he was rudely interrupted. Poor Bilbo couldn't bear it any longer. At "may never return," he began to feel a shriek coming up inside, and very soon it burst out like the whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarves sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light on the end of his magic staff, and in its firework glare, the poor hobbit could be seen kneeling on the hearthrug, shaking like a jelly that was melting. And then he fell flat on the floor and kept calling out, "Struck by lightning! Struck by lightning!" over and over again, and that was all they could get out of him for a long time. So they took him and laid him out of the way on the drawing-room sofa with a drink at his elbow, and they went back to their dark business. "An excitable little fellow," said Gandalf, as they sat down again. "Gets funny, queer fits, but he is one of the best. One of the best. As fierce as a dragon in a pinch." If you have ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you will realize that this was only poetical exaggeration applied to any hobbit, even to old Took's great-grand-uncle Bullroarer, who was so huge for a hobbit that he could ride a horse. He charged the ranks of the goblins of Mount Graham in the Battle of the Green Fields and knocked their king, Goldfimble's head, clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole, and in this way the battle was won, and the game of golf invented at the same moment. In the meanwhile, however, Bullroarer's gentler descendant was reviving in the drawing-room. After a while and a drink, he crept nervously to the door of the parlour. This is what he heard, Glowin speaking. Or some snort more or less like that. "Will he do you think? It's all very well for Gandalf to talk about this hobbit being fierce, but one shriek like that in a moment of excitement would be enough to wake the dragon and all his relatives and kill a lot of us. I think it sounded more like fright than excitement. In fact, if it had not been for the sign on the door, I should have been sure we'd come to the wrong house as soon as I clapped eyes on the little fellow bobbing and puffing on the mat. I had my doubts. He looks more like a grocer than a burglar." Then Mr. Baggins turned the handle and went in. The Took side had won. He suddenly felt he would go without bed and breakfast to be thought fierce. As for the little fellow bobbing on the mat, it almost made him really fierce. Many a time afterwards, the Baggins part regretted what he did now, and he said to himself, "Oh, Bilbo, you were a fool. You walked right in and put your foot in it." "Pardon me," he said, "if I have overheard words that you were saying. I don't pretend to understand what you are talking about, or to your reference to burglars, but I think I'm right in believing," this is what he called being on his dignity, "that you think I am no good. I will show you. I have no signs on my door. It was painted a week ago, and I'm quite sure you've come to the wrong house. As soon as I saw your funny faces on the doorstep, I had my doubts. But treat it as the right one. Tell me what you want done, and I will try. If I have to walk from here to the east of East and fight the wild wereworms in the last desert. I had a great-great-great-grand-uncle once, Bullroarer Took, and—" Yes, but that was long ago," said Glowin. "I was talking about you, and I assure you there is a mark on this door, the usual one in the trade, or used to be. Burglar wants a good job, plenty of excitement and reasonable reward. That's how it's usually read. But you can say expert treasure hunter instead of burglar if you like. Some of them do. It's all the same to us. Gandalf told us there was a man of the sort in these parts looking for a job at once, and that he had arranged for a meeting here this Wednesday tea time." "Of course there is a mark," said Gandalf. "I put it there myself, for very good reasons. You asked me to find the 14th man for your expedition, and I chose Mr. Baggins. Just let anyone say I chose the wrong man or the wrong house, and you can stop at 13 and have all the bad luck you like, or go back to digging coal." He scowled so angrily at Glowin that the dwarf huddled back in his chair, and when Bilbo tried to open his mouth to ask a question, he turned and frowned at him and stuck out his bushy eyebrows till Bilbo shut his mouth tight with a snap. "That's right," said Gandalf. "Let's have no more argument. I have chosen Mr. Baggins, and that ought to be enough for all of you. If I say he is a burglar he is,
or will be when the time comes. There is a lot more in him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. You may, possibly, all live to thank me yet. Now, Bilbo, my boy, fetch the lamp, and let's have a little light on this."
On the table, in the light of a big lamp with a red shade, he spread a piece of parchment, rather like a map.
"This was made by Thror, your grandfather, Thorin," he said in answer to the dwarves' excited questions. "It is a plan of the mountain."
"I don't see that this will help us much," said Thorin disappointedly after a glance. "I remember the mountain well enough, and the lands about it, and I know where Mirkwood is, and the withered heath where the great dragons bred." "There is a dragon marked in red on the mountain," said Balin, "but it will be easy enough to find him without that if we ever arrive there."
"There is one point you haven't noticed," said the wizard, "and that is the secret entrance. You see that rune on the west side, and a hand pointing to it from the other runes. That marks a hidden passage to the lower halls."
"It may have been secret once," said Thorin, "but how do we know that it is secret any longer? Old Smaug has lived there long enough now to find out anything there is to know about those caves."
"He may, but he can't have used it for years and years."
"Why?"
"Because it is too small. 5 feet high the door, and 3 may walk abreast, say the runes. But Smaug could not creep into a hole that size, not even when he was a young dragon, certainly not after devouring so many of the dwarves and men of Dale."
"Well, it seems a great big hole to me," squeaked Bilbo, who had no experience of dragons and only of hobbit holes. He was getting excited and interested again, so that he forgot to keep his mouth shut. He loved maps, and in his hall there hung a large one of the country round, with all his favourite walks marked on it in red ink. How could such a large door be kept secret from everybody outside, apart from the dragon? He asked. He was only a little hobbit, you must remember.
"In lots of ways," said Gandalf, "but in what way this one has been hidden we don't know without going to see. From what it says on the map, I should guess there is a closed door which has been made to look exactly like the side of the mountain. That is the usual dwarves' method. I think that is right, isn't it?"
"Quite right," said Thorin.
"Also,"
went on Gandalf, "I forgot to mention that with the map went a key.
a small and curious key.
Here it is," he said, and handed to Thorin a key with a long barrel and intricate wards made of silver.
"Keep it safe."
"Indeed I will," said Thorin, and he fastened it upon a fine chain that hung about his neck and under his jacket. Now things begin to look more hopeful. This news alters them much for the better. So far we have had no clear idea what to do. We thought of going east, as quiet and careful as we could, as far as the Long Lake. After that, the trouble would begin.
"Oh, a long time before that, if I know anything about the roads east," interrupted Gandalf.
"We might go from there up along the river running," went on Thorin, taking no notice, "and so to the ruins of Dale, the old town in the valley there, under the shadow of the mountain. But we none of us like the idea of the front gate. The river runs right out of it through the great cliff at the south of the mountain, and out of it comes the dragon too, far too often, unless he's changed his habits."
"That would be no good," said the wizard. "Not without a mighty warrior, even a hero. I tried to find one, but warriors are busy fighting one another in distant lands, and in this neighborhood heroes are scarce or simply not to be found. Swords in these parts are mostly blunt, and axes are used for trees, and shields as cradles or dish covers, and dragons are comfortably far off, and therefore legendary. That is why I settled on burglary, especially when I remembered the existence of a side door. And here is our little Bilbo Baggins, the burglar, the chosen and selected burglar. So now, let's get on and make some plans."
"Very well, then," said Thorin. "Supposing the burglar gives us some ideas or suggestions." He turned with mock politeness to Bilbo. Well, first I should like to know a bit more about things, said he, feeling all confused and a bit shaky inside, but so far still tookishly determined to go on with things. I mean, about the gold and the dragon and all that, and how it got there and who it belongs to and so on and further.
Bless me, said Thorin. Haven't you got a map? And didn't you hear our song? And haven't we been talking about all this for hours?
All the same, I should like it all plain and clear, said he, obstinately putting on his business manner usually reserved for people who tried to borrow money off him, and doing his best to appear wise and prudent and professional and live up to Gandalf's recommendation. Also, I should like to know about risks, out-of-pocket expenses, time required, and remuneration, and so forth, by which he meant, what am I going to get out of it, and am I going to come back alive?
Oh, very well, said Thorin. Long ago, in my grandfather Thror's time, our family was driven out of the far north and came back with all their wealth and their tools to this mountain on the map. It had been discovered by my far ancestor Thrain the Old, but now they mined and they tunnelled and they made huge halls and great workshops. And in addition, I believe they found a good deal of gold and a great many jewels too. Anyway, they grew immensely rich and famous, and my grandfather was king under the mountain again, and treated with great reverence by the mortal men who lived to the south and were gradually spreading up the running river as far as the valley overshadowed by the mountain. They built the merry town of Dale there in those days. Kings used to send for our smiths, and reward even the least skilful most richly. Fathers would beg us to take their sons as apprentices, and pay us handsomely, especially in food supplies, which we never bothered to grow or find for ourselves. Altogether, those were good days for us, and the poorest of us had money to spend and to lend, and leisure to make beautiful things just for the fun of it, not to speak of the most marvellous and magical toys, the like of which is not to be found in the world nowadays. So, my grandfather's halls became full of armour and jewels and carvings and cups, and the toy market of Dale was the wonder of the north. Undoubtedly that was what brought the dragon. Dragons steal gold and jewels, you know, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them, and they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they're killed. And never enjoy a brass ring of it. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from a bad, though they usually have a good notion of the current market value, and they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armour. There were lots of dragons in the north in those days, and gold was probably getting scarce up there, with the dwarves flying south or getting killed, and all the general waste and destruction that dragons make going from bad to worse. There was a most specially greedy, strong, and wicked worm called Smaug. One day he flew up into the air and came south. The first we heard of it was a noise like a hurricane coming from the north, and the pine trees on the mountain creaking and cracking in the wind. Some of the dwarves who happened to be outside, I was one, luckily, a fine adventurous lad in those days, always wandering about, and it saved my life that day. Well, from a good way off, we saw the dragon settle on our mountain in a spout of flame. Then he came down the slopes, and when he reached the woods, they all went up in fire. By that time, all the bells were ringing in Dale, and the warriors were arming. The dwarves rushed out of their great gate, but there was the dragon waiting for them. None escaped that way. The river rushed up in steam, and a fog fell on Dale, and in the fog the dragon came on them and destroyed most of the warriors. The usual unhappy story. It was only too common in those days. Then he went back and crept in through the front gate and routed out all the halls and lanes and tunnels, alleys, cellars, mansions and passages. After that there were no dwarves left alive inside, and he took all their wealth for himself. Probably, for that is the dragon's way, he has piled it all up in a great heap far inside and sleeps on it for a bed. Later, He used to crawl out of the great gate and come by night to Dale and carry away people, especially maidens, to eat until Dale was ruined. And all the people dead or gone. What goes on there now I don't know for certain, but I don't suppose anyone lives nearer to the mountain than the far edge of the long lake nowadays. The few of us that were well outside sat and wept in hiding and cursing Smaug. And there we were, unexpectedly joined by my father and grandfather with singed beards. They looked very grim, but they said very little. When I asked how they'd got away, they told me to hold my tongue and said that one day in the proper time I should know. After that we went away, and we have had to earn our livings as best we could up and down the lands, often enough sinking as low as blacksmith work or even coal mining. But we have never forgotten our stolen treasure. And even now, when I will allow, we have a good bit laid by and are not so badly off. Here Thorin stroked the gold chain around his neck. We still mean to get it back, and to bring our curses home to Smaug, if we can. I've often wondered about my father's and my grandfather's escape. I see now they must have had a private side door, which only they knew about, but apparently they made a map, and I should like to know how Gandalf got hold of it and why it did not come down to me, the rightful heir. I did not get hold of it. I was given it, said the wizard. Your grandfather Thror was killed, you remember, in the mines of Moria by Azog the goblin. Curse his name, yes, said Thorin. And Thrain, your father, went away on the 21st of April 100 years ago last Thursday and has never been seen by you since. True, said Thorin. Well, your father gave me this to give you, and if I have chosen my own time and way for handing it over, you can hardly blame me, considering the trouble I had to find you. Your father could not remember his own name when you came to give me the paper, and he never told me yours. So on the whole, I think I ought to be praised and thanked. Here it is, said he, handing the map to Thorin. I don't understand, said Thorin, and Bilbo felt he would like to say the same. The explanation did not seem to explain. Your grandfather, said the wizard slowly and grimly, gave the map to his son for safety before he went to the mines of Moria. Your father went away to try his luck with the map after your grandfather was killed, and lots of adventures of a most unpleasant sort he had, but he never got near the mountain. How he got there I don't know, but I found him a prisoner in the dungeons of the necromancer.
Risky.
Whatever were you doing there? Asked Thorin with a shudder, and all the dwarves shivered. Never you mind. I was finding things out as usual, and a nasty, dangerous business it was. Even I, Gandalf, only just escaped. I tried to save your father, but it was too late. He was witless and wandering, and had forgotten almost everything except the map and the key. We have long ago paid the goblins of Moria, said Thorin. We must give a thought to the necromancer. Don't be absurd. He is an enemy far beyond the powers of all the dwarves put together, if they could all be collected again from the four corners of the world. The one thing your father wished was for his son to read the map and use the key. The dragon and the mountain are more than big enough tasks for you. Here, said Bilbo, and accidentally said it aloud. Hear what? They all said, turning suddenly towards him, and he was so flustered that he answered, Hear what I have got to say. What's that? They asked. Well, I should say that you ought to go east and have a look around, and after all there is a side door and dragons must sleep sometimes, I suppose. If you sit on the doorstep long enough, I dare say you'll think of something, and, well, don't you know, I think we have talked long enough for one night, if you see what I mean. What about bed and an early start and all that? I'll give you a good breakfast before you go. Before we go, I suppose you mean, said Thorin. Aren't you the burglar? And isn't sitting on the doorstep your job? Not to speak of getting inside the door. But I agree about bed and breakfast. I like 6 eggs with me ham when starting on a journey, fried, not poached, and mind you, don't break 'em. After all the others had ordered their breakfasts without so much as a please, which annoyed Bilbo very much, they all got up. The Hobbit had to find room for all of them and filled all his spare rooms and made beds on chairs and sofas before he got them all stowed and went to his own little bed, very tired and not altogether happy. One thing he did make his mind up about was not to bother to get up very early and cook everybody else's wretched breakfast. The tookishness was wearing off, and he was not now quite so sure that he was going on any journey in the morning. As he lay in bed, he could hear Thorin still humming to himself in the best bedroom next to him. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to find our long forgotten gold. Bilbo went to sleep with that in his ears, and it gave him very uncomfortable dreams. It was long after the break of day when he woke up. Chapter 2. Roast Mutton. Up jumped Bilbo and, putting on his dressing gown, went into the dining room. There he saw nobody, but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room, and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe the party of the night before had not been part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved to think that they had all gone without him, and without bothering to wake him up. But never a thank you, he thought. And yet, in a way, he could not help feeling just a trifle disappointed. The feeling surprised him. Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins, he said to himself, thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age. So he put on an apron, lit fires, boiled water, and washed up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining room. By that time the sun was shining and the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and to forget about the night before. In fact, he was just sitting down to a nice little second breakfast in the dining room by the open window when in walked Gandalf. "My dear fellow," said he, "whenever are you going to come? What about an early start? And here you are, having breakfast or whatever you call it at 10:30. They left you the message because they could not wait." "Well, what message?" said poor Mr. Baggins, all in a fluster. "Great elephant," said Gandalf, "you are not at all yourself this morning. You have never dusted the mantelpiece." "Well, what's that got to do with it? I've had enough to do with washing up for 14. "If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found this just under the clock," said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, on his own notepaper. This is what he read. "Thorin and company, to burglar Bilbo greeting. For your hospitality, our sincerest thanks, and for your offer of professional assistance, our grateful acceptance. Terms: cash on delivery, up to and not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All travelling expenses guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives, if occasion arises and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp, trusting that you will be punctual. We have the honour to remain yours deeply, Thorin and Co." "That leaves you just 10 minutes. You will have to run," said Gandalf. "But," said Bilbo. "No time for it," said the wizard. "But," said Bilbo again. "No time for that either. Off you go."
To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside without a hat, a walking stick, or any money, or anything that he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half-finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands, and running as fast as his furry feet could carry him down the lane, past the Great Mill, across the water, and then on for a mile or more. Very puffed he was when he got to Bywater just on the stroke of 11, and he found he had come without a pocket handkerchief. "Bravo!" said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of baggages, packages, parcels and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently for Bilbo.
"Up you two get, and off we go," said Thorin.
"Oh, I'm awfully sorry," said Bilbo, "but I have come without my hat, and I have left my pocket handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money, and I didn't get your note until after 10:45, to be precise."
"Don't be precise," said Dwalin, "and don't worry. You will have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs and a good many other things before you get to the journey's end. As for a hat, I have got a spare hood and a cloak in my luggage."
That's how they all came to start jogging off from the inn one fine morning just before May on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What his father Bungo would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They had not been riding very long when up came Gandalf, very splendid, on a white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco, so after that the party went along very merrily, and they told stories or sang songs as they rode forward all day, except of course when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but still he began to feel that adventures were not so bad after all. At first they had passed through Hobbit lands, a wide, respectable country inhabited by decent folk, with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands they had been obliged to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry. "To think it'll soon be June," grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea time. It was pouring with rain, and had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes, his cloak was full of water, the pony was tired and stumbled on stones. The others were too grumpy to talk. "And I'm sure the rain has got into the dry clothes and into the food bags," thought Bilbo. "Bother burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I was at home in my nice hole by the fire, with the kettle just beginning to sing." It was not the last time he'd wished that. Still, the dwarves jogged on, never turning round or taking any notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the grey clouds the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark as they went down into a deep valley with a river at the bottom. Wind got up, and willows along its banks bent and sighed. Fortunately, the road went over an ancient stone bridge, for the river, swollen with the rains, came rushing down from the hills and mountains in the north. It was nearly night when they had crossed over. The wind broke up the grey clouds, and a wandering moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper, and where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on? Not until then did they notice that Gandalf was missing. So far he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He had eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he was simply not there at all. Just when a wizard would have been most useful too, groaned Dory and Nori, who shared the Hobbit's views about regular meals, plenty and often. They decided in the end they would have to camp where they were. They moved to a clump of trees and thought it was drier under them. The wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip, drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have got into the fire. Dwarves can make a fire almost anywhere out of almost anything, wind or no wind, but they could not do it that night, not even Owen and Glowin, who were specially good at it. Then one of the ponies took fright at nothing and bolted. He got into the river before they could catch him, and before they could get him out again, Philly and Killy were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that he carried was washed away off him. Of course it was mostly food, and there was mighty little left for supper and less for breakfast. There they all sat, glum and wet and muttering, while Owen and Glowin went on trying to light the fire and quarrelling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures are not all pony rides in May sunshine, when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said, "There's a light over there." There was a hill, some way off, with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out of the dark mass of the trees they could now see a light shining, a reddish, comfortable-looking light, as it might be a fire or torches twinkling. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said no, and some said yes. Some said they could but go and see, and anything was better than little supper, less breakfast, and wet clothes all the night. Others said, "These parts are none too well known, and are too near the mountains. Travellers seldom come this way now. The old maps are no use. Things have changed for the worse, and the road is unguarded. They have seldom even heard of the king around here, and the less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you are likely to find." Some said, "After all, there are 14 of us." Others said, "Where has Gandalf got to?" This remark was repeated by everybody. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Owen and Glowin began to fight. That settled it. "After all, we have got a burglar with us," they said, and so they made off, leading their ponies, with all due and proper caution, in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead to a house or a farm, and do what they could, they made a deal of rustling and crackling and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and dratting as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. Suddenly the red light shone out very bright through the tree trunks not far ahead. "Now it is the burglar's turn," they said, meaning Bilbo. "You must go on and find out all about that light and what it is for, and if all is perfectly safe and canny," said Thorin to the Hobbit, "now scuttle off and come back quick if all is well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can." Off Bilbo had to go before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of owl, any more than fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quietly in woods, absolutely quietly. They take pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed more than once at what he called all this dwarvish racket as they went along, though I don't suppose you or I would have noticed anything at all on a windy night, not if the whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo walking primly towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So naturally he got right up to the fire, for fire it was, without disturbing anyone. And this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting round a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell. Also there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously, trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that, from the great heavy faces of them, and their size, and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing-room fashion at all. At all.
Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow, said one of the trolls. Never a blinking bit of man flesh have we had for long enough, said a second. What the hell William was a-thinking of to bring us into these parts at all beats me. And the drink running short, what's more, he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. Shut your mouth, he said as soon as he could. You can't expect folk to stop here forever just to be ate by you and Bert. You've had a village and a half between you since we come down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up our way when you'd have said thank you, Bill, for a nice bit of fat valley mutton like what this is. He took a big bite off a sheep's leg he was toasting and wiped his lips on his sleeve. Yes, I am afraid trolls do behave like that, even those with only one head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try toasted dwarf or even pony for a change, or else he should have done a bit of good, quick burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the trolls' pockets. It is nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it. Pinched the very mutton off the spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Others, more practical but with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger into each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read of a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed, as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various burglarious proceedings he had heard of, picking the troll's pockets seemed the least difficult. So at last he crept behind a tree, just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. Ha! Thought he, warming to his new work as he lifted it carefully out. This is a beginning. It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. Yeah. Oh, you, it squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned round at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind the tree. Blimey, Bert, look what I've copped, said William. What is it? Said the others, coming up. Lummy if I know. What are you? Bilbo Baggins, a Hobbit, said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him. A Hobbit, said they, a bit startled. Trolls are slow in the uptake and mighty suspicious about anything new to them. What's a Hobbit got to do in my pocket anyways? Said William. And can you cook 'em? Said Tom. You can try, said Bert, picking up a skewer. He wouldn't make above a mouthful, said William, who had already had a fine supper, not when he was skinned and boned. Perhaps there's more like him round about, and we might make a pie, said Bert. Here, you, are there any more of your sort sneaking in these here woods, you nasty little rabbit? Said he, looking at the Hobbit's furry feet, and he picked him up by the toes and shook him. Yes, lots, said Bilbo, before he remembered not to give his friends away. No, none at all, not one, he said immediately afterwards. What do you mean? Said Bert, holding him right way up, by the hair this time. What I say, said Bilbo, gasping, and please don't cook me, kind sirs. I am a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean. I cook beautifully for you, a perfectly beautiful breakfast for you, if only you won't have me for supper. Poor little blighter, said William. He had already had as much supper as he could hold. Also, he had had lots of beer. Poor little blighter. Let him go. Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all, said Bert. I don't want to have me throat cut in me sleep. Hold his toes in the fire till he talks. I won't have it, said William. I caught him anyway. "You're a fat fool, William," said Bert, "as I've said afore this evening. And you're a lout, and I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins," said Bert, and puts his fist in William's eye. Then there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet before they were fighting like dogs and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms and rolling nearly into the fire, kicking and thumping while Tom whacked at them both with a branch to bring them to their senses, and that, of course, only made them madder than ever. That would have been the time for Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round. So there he lay for a while, panting, just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fight, up came Balin. The dwarves had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one to creep towards the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarves, uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately and, "A sack, Tom, quick!" they said. Before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening, a sack was over his head and he was down. "There's more to come yet," said Tom, "or I'm mighty mistook. Lots and none at all, it is," said he. "No burr of hobbits, but lots of these here dwarves. That's about the shape of it." "I reckon you're right," said Bert. "Then we'd best get out of the light." And so they did, with sacks in their hands that they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder. They waited in the shadows. As each dwarf came up and looked at the fire and the spilled jugs and the gnawed mutton, in surprise, pop went a nasty, smelly sack over his head and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Balin, and Filly and Killy together, and Dorry and Norry and Orry all in a heap, and Owen and Glowin and Biffer and Boffer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire. "That'll teach 'em," said Tom, for Biffer and Bomber had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad, as dwarves will when cornered. Thorin came last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not all well. He stood outside in the shadows some way off and said, "What's all this trouble? Who's been knocking my people about?" "It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They had forgotten all about him. "They're hiding in the bushes with sacks," said he. "Oh, are they?" said Thorin, and he jumped forward to the fire before they could leap on him. He caught up a big branch all on fire at one end, and Bert got that end in his eye before he could step aside. That put him out of the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg as well as he could. It was thick as a young tree trunk, but he was sent spinning up into the top of some bushes when Tom kicked the sparks up in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that, and lost one of the front ones. It made him howl, I can tell you. But just at that moment, William came up behind and popped a sack right over Thorin's head and down to his toes, and so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks, with 3 angry trolls and 2 with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly or mince them fine and boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly. And Bilbo, up in a bush, with his clothes and his skin torn, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back, but no one saw him. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarves now and eat them later. That was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument, they had all agreed to it. "No good roasting them now. It'll take all night," said a voice. Bert thought it was William's. "Don't start the argument all over again, Bill," he said, "or it will take all night." "Who's arguing?" said William, who thought it was Bert who had spoken. "You are," said Bert. "You're a liar," said William, and so the argument began all over again. In the end, they decided to mince them fine and boil them. So they got a great black pot, and they took out their knives. No good boiling 'em. We ain't got no water, and it's a long way down to the well and all, said a voice.
Bert and William thought it was Tom's.
Shut up, said they, or we'll never have done. And you can fetch the water yourself if you say any more. Shut up yourself, said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. Who's arguing but you, I'd like to know? You're a booby, said William. Booby yourself, said Tom.
And so the argument began all over again and went on hotter than ever until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squash them and boil them next time.
Who shall we sit on first? Said the voice. Better sit on the last fellow first, said Bert, whose eye had been damaged by Thorin.
He thought Tom was talking.
Don't talk to yourself, said Tom. But if you wants to sit on the last one, sit on him. Which is he? The one with the yellow stockings, said Bert. Nonsense, the one with the grey stockings, said a voice like William's. I made sure it was yellow, said Bert. Yellow it was, said William. Then what did you say it was grey for? Said Bert. I never did, Tom said it. That I never did, said Tom, it was you. 2-1, so shut your mouth, said Bert. Who are you talking to? Said William. Now stop it, said Tom and Bert together. The night's getting on, and dawn comes early. Let's get on with it. Dawn take you all and be stoned to you, said a voice that sounded like William's, but it wasn't, for just at that moment the light came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood turned to stone as he stopped, and Bert and Tom were stuck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone, unless the birds perch on them, for trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains they are made of and never move again. That is what happened to Bert and Tom and William. Excellent, said Gandalf as he stepped from behind a tree and helped Bilbo to climb down out of a thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarrelling until the light came and made an end of them. The next thing to do was to untie the sacks and let out the dwarves. They were nearly suffocated and very annoyed. They had not at all enjoyed lying here, listening to the trolls making plans for roasting them and squashing them and mincing them. They had to hear Bilbo's account of what had happened to him twice over before they were satisfied. Silly time to go practicing pinching and pocket-picking, said Bomber, when what we wanted was fire and food. And that's just what you wouldn't have got with those fellows without a struggle in any case, said Gandalf. Anyhow, you are wasting time now. Don't you realize that the trolls must have a cave or a hole dug somewhere near to hide from the sun in? We must look into it. They searched about and soon found the marks of trolls' stony boots going away through the trees. They followed the tracks up the hill until, hidden by bushes, they came on a big door of stone leading to a cave. But they could not open it. Not though they all pushed while Gandalf tried various incantations. Would this be any good? Asked Bilbo when they were getting tired and angry. I found it on the ground where the trolls had their fight. He held out a largish key, though no doubt William thought it very small and secret. It must have fallen out of his pocket very luckily before he was turned to stone. Why on earth didn't you mention it before? They cried. Gandalf grabbed it and fitted it into the keyhole. Then the stone door swung back with one big push, and they all went inside. There were bones on the floor, and a nasty smell was in the air. There was a good deal of food jumbled carelessly on shelves and on the ground, among an untidy litter of plunder of all sorts, from brass buttons to pots full of gold coins standing in a corner. There were lots of clothes, too, hanging on the walls. Too small for trolls, I'm afraid they belonged to victims. And among them were several swords of various makes, shapes and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly because of their beautiful scabbards and jeweled hilts. Gandalf and Thorin each took one of these, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for the Hobbit. These look like good blades, They were not smith among men in these parts and days. But when we can read the runes on them, we shall know more about them.
You are the Magi from
Get out of this horrible smell, said Philly. So they carried out the pots of coins and such food as was untouched and looked fit to
I am
eat.
Magi to no
Also,
Pharaoh.
one barrel of ale, which was still full. By that time, they felt like breakfast.
I
And
can't
being
read
very
my
hungry,
own
they did not
name,
turn their
Max.
noses up at what they had got from the troll's larder. Their own provisions were very scanty. Now, they had
find
bread
you.
and cheese and plenty of ale
We
and bacon
will
to
find
toast
you.
in the embers of the
In
fire.
your sleep!
After that, they slept, for their night had been disturbed, and they did nothing more
Sleep.
till the
I
afternoon.
never sleep.
Then they brought up their ponies and carried
I
away the
just
pots
wait
of gold and buried them
in
very
the
secretly,
shadows,
not far from the
and
tree,
I will
by
kill
the
you
river,
all.
putting a great many
Everyone who
spells on them,
sniffed the air
just
that
in
day
case
in
they ever had the
Sewa!
chance to come back and recover them. When that was done, they all mounted once more and jogged along again on the path towards the east. Where did you go to, if I may ask? Said Thorin to Gandalf. Go ahead, said he. Brought me back in the nick of time. Looking behind, said he.
You killed my master and left me for dead. That was a
Could you be
mistake.
more plain?
The master was
I
a
went on
man.
to spy out our
I
way.
am his sworn
It would soon
bodyguard.
become
It's
dangerous.
a question of honor.
Also, I was anxious
I am the
about
Magi of
replenishing
Siwa.
our small stock
Then
of
you are
provisions.
unworthy of
I
honor.
had not gone very far, however, when I met a couple of friends of mine from Rivendell.
Where's that?
You are weak
Don't
than
interrupt,
I.
said Gandalf.
I am
We'll
powerful.
get there in a few days now if we're lucky, and find out all about it. As I was saying, I met two of Elrond's people. They were hurrying along for fear of the trolls. It was they who told me that the three of them had come down from the mountains and settled in the woods not far from the
I
road.
respect
They
your
had frightened
tenacity.
everyone away from the district, and they waylaid strangers. I immediately had a feeling that I was wanted back. Looking behind, I saw a fire. So, now you know. Please, be more careful next time, or we shall never get anywhere. Thank you, said Thorin.
Chapter 3. A Short Rest. They did not sing or tell stories that day, even though the weather improved, nor the next day, nor the day after. They had begun to feel that danger was not far
This
away.
place
on
will
either
serve
side.
us too.
They camped under the stars, and their horses had more to eat than they'd had, for there was plenty of grass. But there was not much in their bags, even with what they had
Question
got.
of honor. It is a fight to the death.
One morning they forded a river at a wide, shallow place full of the noise of stones and foam. The far bank was steep and slippery. When they got to the top of it, leading their ponies, they saw that the great mountains had marched down very near to them. Already they seemed only a day's easy journey from the feet of the nearest. Dark and drear, though there were patches of sunlight on its brown sides, and behind its shoulders the tips of snow peaks gleamed. Is that the mountain? Asked Bilbo in a solemn voice, looking at it around. He had never seen a thing that was so big before. Of course not. That is only the beginning of the Misty Mountains, and we have got to get through or over or under them somehow before we can come into Wilderland beyond. It is a deal of a way even from the other side of them to the lonely mountain in the east, where Smaug lies upon treasure. Said Bilbo, and just at that moment he felt more tired than he ever remembered feeling before. He was thinking once again of his comfortable chair before the fire, in his favourite sitting room, in his hobbit hole, and of the kettle singing. Not for the last
These
time.
scarabs must be coming from somewhere.
Now, Gandalf led the way. We must not miss the road, or we shall be done for, he said. We need food for one thing, and rest in reasonable safety. Also, it is very necessary to tackle the Misty Mountains by the proper path, or else you will get lost in them and have to come back and start at the beginning again, if you ever get back at all. They asked him where he was making for, and he answered, "You are come to the very edge of the wild, as some of you may know. Hidden somewhere ahead of us is the fair valley of Rivendell, where Elrond lives in the last homely house. I sent a message by my friends,
This must
and
have
we
been
are
built
expecting.
centuries upon centuries ago.
That sounded nice and comforting, but they had not got there yet, and it was not so easy as it sounds to find that last homely house west of the mountains. There seemed to be no trees and no valley and no hills to break the ground in front of them. Only one vast slope going slowly up and up to meet the feet of the nearest mountain. A wide land the colour of heather and crumbling rock, with patches and slashes of grass green and moss green showing where water might be. Morning passed, afternoon came, but in all the silent
there.
waste there was
Light.
no sign of any dwelling. They were growing anxious, for they saw now that the house might be hidden almost anywhere between them and the mountains. They came on unexpected valleys, narrow with steep sides that opened suddenly at their feet, and they looked down, surprised to see trees below them and running water at the bottom. There were gullies they could almost leap over, but very deep with waterfalls in them. There were dark ravines that one could neither jump over nor climb into. There were bogs, some of them green and pleasant places to look at, with flowers growing bright and tall, but a pony that walked there with a pack on its back would never have come out of it.
You are telling me?
It was indeed a much wider land from the ford to the mountains than ever you had
Supposed to be dead.
Bilbo was astonished. The only path was marked with white stones, some of which were small. The others were half covered with moss or heather. Altogether, it was a very slow business following the track, even guided by Gandalf, who seemed to know his way about pretty well. His head and beard wagged this way and that as he looked for the stones, and they followed his lead, but they seemed no nearer to the end of the search when the day began to fail.
I see you have
Tea
made new
time had
friends.
long gone by, and it seemed
They were setting
supper
up an
time
ambush.
would soon do the
Good thing I
same.
came to welcome you, huh?
There were moths fluttering about, and the light
Been months.
became very
Look at that
dim,
beard, huh?
for the moon had not
Been
risen.
nearly a year, my friend.
Bilbo's
Good to
pony
get out
began
of
to
time
stumble
practice.
over roots and stones. They came to the
See what
edge of a
everyone
steep
differs
fall
to
in the ground
soldiers
so
and
suddenly
that.
that Gandalf's
What?
horse nearly slipped down the slope.
I've killed one of the masked
Here
ones.
it is at last,
The Heron.
He called, and the others gathered round him and looked over the edge. They saw a valley far below. They could hear
been a
the
long road.
voice of hurrying water in a
Any
rocky
rest?
bed at the bottom. The scent of trees was in
No
the
rest.
air, and there was a light
Not
on
until
the
all the
valley
masked
side
ones'
across
guts
the
lie
water.
baking in the sand.
Bilbo never
Gods,
forgot the way
I
they
have
slithered
missed
and
you.
slipped in the dusk down the steep zigzag path into
Where
the
is your
secret
mouth?
valley of Rivendell. The air grew warmer as they got lower,
Ah,
and the smell of the
there you
pine
are,
trees
boy.
made him drowsy,
Let
so
us
that
go.
every now and again he
How have you
nodded
been holding up
and
since I
nearly
left?
fell off or bumped his nose
Ah,
on the
it has
pony's
been
neck.
difficult by acting.
Their spirits
Without
rose
you,
as
the
they went
villagers look
down
to me
and
to keep
down.
order.
The trees changed to
soldiers
beech
have
and
set
oak,
up a garrison.
and there was a
They rule
comfortable
over
feeling
all.
in the twilight.
A garrison in Siwa.
The last
Ptolemy
green
wants the
had
entire
almost
region to
faded
let the
out
hill.
of the grass,
I do my best
and
to
they
keep
came
the
at length
villagers out of
to an
trouble.
open glade
I
not
could use
far
your
above
help.
the banks of the
I'll
stream.
do what I can. But do not forget, I have my own justice to
Smells
pursue.
like apples.
Ah, I knew I could count on you, Sammy.
And he looked up at the stars. They were burning bright and blue. Just then, there came a burst of song, like laughter
What happened here?
in the trees.
The garrison soldiers are
Oh,
brutal.
what are you doing and where are you
suspect the
going?
villagers
Your
like to
ponies
them,
need
they burn this
shoeing. The
neighborhood.
river is
And
flowing.
worse.
Oh, tra-la-la-lally, here down in the valley. Oh, what are you seeking and what are you making? The faggots are reeking, the bannocks are baking. Oh, tra-la-li-lolly, the valley is jolly, ha-ha. Oh, where are you going with beards all a-wagging?
Welcome home, Bayer.
No knowing,
See
no
what has
knowing what
missed.
brings Mr. Baggins and Balin and Dwallin down into the valley in June. Ha ha. Oh, will you be staying or will you be flying? Your ponies are straying, the daylight is dying. To fly would be folly, to stay would be jolly. And listen and hark till the end of the dark
No one in
to
the
our
Wild could make a move
tune.
without being questioned, threatened, taxed, or beaten.
So they
We all
laughed
have
and
learned
sang
to
in the
obey
trees,
our
and
gods.
pretty fair nonsense, I
See
dare
how
say you
it
think.
is.
Not that
Let's
they
not
would
attract
care.
attention.
They would only laugh all the more if you told them so. They were elves, of course. Soon Bilbo caught glimpses of them as the darkness deepened. He loved elves, though he seldom met them, but he was a little frightened of them too.
Are you going to go to your house?
Dwarves don't get on well with them. Even decent enough dwarves like Thorin and his friends think them foolish, which is a very foolish thing to think, or get annoyed with them. For some elves tease them and laugh at them, and most of all,
As you can
at
see,
their
the
beards.
soldiers have become more brutal since he arrived.
Well,
Before
said
they
a
got
voice,
drunk,
just
fought with
look,
the villagers.
Bilbo the Hobbit on a
Now that
pony,
the
my
new moon
dear,
is
isn't
here,
it
They
delicious?
are disciplined.
Most
vicious.
astonishing,
All the
wonderful.
more reason to
But
kill
off
him.
they went into
Do
another
not
song,
take him lightly.
as ridiculous
He
as
is
the one
lean and
I have written
sinewy.
down in full.
But very powerful.
At last, one, a tall young fellow, came out from the trees and bowed to Gandalf and to Thorin. "Welcome to the valley," he said. "Thank you," said Thorin a bit gruffly. But Gandalf was already off his horse and among the elves, talking merrily with them.
Leave your mount. He will not
"You
stray
are a
far.
little out of your way,"
Go
said the
ahead,
elf.
Oni.
"That is, if you are making for the only path across the water and to the house beyond. We will set you right, but you had best get on foot until you are over the bridge. Are you going to stay a bit and sing with us, or will you go straight
Rest,
on?
my friend. It
Supper
has
is
been a
preparing
difficult
over
day.
there."
I
he
have
said.
no interest
"I can
in
smell the
rest.
wood fires for the cooking."
I must prepare for this man.
Tired as he was, Bilbo would have liked to stay a while. Elvish singing is not a thing to miss in June, under the stars, not if you care for such things. Also, he would have
you
liked
know
to have
me,
a
eh?
few
You
private
should be
words with
worried.
these people that seemed to know his names and all about him, although he had never seen them
fine.
before.
Sit.
He thought their opinion of his adventure might be interesting. Elves know a lot and are
you
wondrous
haven't
folk
changed.
for news, and know what is going on
And I,
among the peoples of the land
I've
as
always
quick as
patched you
water
two up.
flows, or
Made
quicker.
excuses to your
But the
parents.
dwarves were all for supper as soon as
Times have
possible to
changed.
stand and would not stay.
I can
On
count
they all went, leading their ponies till they were brought to a good path, and so at last to the very brink of the river. It was flowing fast and noisily as mountain streams do of a summer evening, when sun has been all day on the snow far up above. There was only a narrow bridge of stone, without a parapet as narrow as a pony could well walk on, and over that they had to go slow and careful,
Slumbering or
one by one,
silence?
each leading his pony by the
I thought you
bridle.
would never wake up.
The elves had
Rabia
brought
patched me
bright
up, and I
lanterns to the
just-
shore,
I let you
and they
sleep.
sang a
You
merry
need to
song
be alert
as the
to
party
tangle
went
with
across.
Medunamun. In fact, my
"Don't dip
friend,
your beard in the foam, father,"
A
they
new
cried
bow.
to Thorin,
See if you
who was
like
bent almost onto his hands and knees.
Best
"It is
way to
long
hit
enough
is right in the
without watering it. Mind Bilbo doesn't eat all the
One
cakes,"
of the
they
dummies
called.
is sturdier
"He is
than the
too
other."
fat to get through keyholes yet."
more arrows. are
Hush,
wrapped over there.
hush, good people, and good night, said Gandalf, who came last. Valleys have ears, and some elves have over-merry tongues. Good night.
What is it?
And so at last they all came to the last homely house
Come,
and
quickly.
found its doors flung wide. Now, it is a strange thing, but things that are good to have and days that are good to spend are soon told about, and not much to listen to, while things that are uncomfortable, palpitating, and even gruesome may make a good tale and take a deal of telling anyway. They stayed long in that good house, 14 days at least, and they found it hard to leave. Bilbo would gladly have stopped there forever and ever, even supposing a wish would have
He will
taken
find
him
my
right
letters
back
and
to his
burn
hobbit
down
hole
my
without
place.
trouble. Yet
I'll be
there is
executed.
little to tell
Don't
about
worry.
their stay.
I will take care of this.
The master of the house was an elf
Watch
friend,
out.
one of those people whose fathers came into
Who's
the
there?
strange stories
Keep low.
before the beginning of history, the wars of the evil
is getting
goblins
too
and the
close.
elves and the first men in the north. In those days of our tale, there were still some people who had both elves and heroes of the north for
Now
ancestors,
for the
and
rest of them.
Elrond, the master of the house, was their chief. He was as noble and as fair in face as an elf lord, as strong as a warrior, as wise as a wizard, as venerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as summer. He comes into many tales, but his part in the story of Bilbo's great adventure is only a small, though important, as you will see if we ever get to the end of it. His house was perfect. Whether you liked food, or sleep, or work, or storytelling, or singing, or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of the four. Evil things did not come into that valley. I wish I had time to tell you even a few of the tales, or one or two of the songs that they heard in that house. All of them, the ponies as well, grew refreshed and strong in a few days there. Their clothes were mended as well as their bruises, their tempers and their hopes. Their bags were filled with food and provisions, light to carry, but strong to bring them over the mountain passes. Their plans were improved with the best advice. So the time came for Midsummer Eve, and they were to go on again with the early sun on Midsummer morning. Elrond knew all about runes of every kind.
Thank you, Bai.
That day, he
I
looked at the
told you this
swords
naked
they had
idiot
brought
did
from the
not
troll's
care.
lair, and he
I cannot
said,
believe their gall.
"These
It is sad.
are not
Come
troll
upstairs. I will show you all
They
the
are
magic
old
duties of Siwa.
swords, very old swords, of the high elves of the west, my kin.
All the problems of Siwa.
They were
are
made in
here.
Gondolin for the Goblin Wars. They must
I
have
try to
come
help
from
everyone,
a
but it
dragon's
is more than
horde
I can do.
or goblin
So you're telling me you
plunder,
do not have the
for
powers of a
dragons
god?
and the goblins destroyed that
But
city many
the real
ages
problem is
ago.
that man you want to kill.
This,
A
Thorin,
Junimon.
the rune's name,
The people were hopeful when he first
Orcrist,
arrived.
the goblin
Sure,
cleaver,
things would
in
improve.
the ancient tongue of Gondolin. It
We
was a
soon
famous
learned the
blade.
truth, actually.
This, Gandalf, was Glamdring, foe hammer that the king of Gondolin once wore. Keep them well.
I fear for the safety of
Whence
your
did the
following,
trolls get them,
priest.
I wonder?
I will move them to a more
Looking at his sword with
secure
new
area.
interest. I could not
That
say,
is the
said
man
Elrond,
you're up against.
but one may guess that your trolls had plundered
fight
other
him and kill
plunderers,
him.
or come on the
Junimon is a lot
remnants of
more
old
powerful than he
robberies
looks.
in some
He is
hole in the
surrounded by
mountains
the
of
finest
old.
soldiers.
I do not
I have
care.
heard
You'll
that
be
there are
killed.
still
You need to
forgotten
get tougher
treasures
if
to
you
be
want to
found
battle
in the
that spindly
deserted
ship.
caverns
For
of the
sure,
mines
you'll
of
need better armor.
Moria since the
I
dwarf
can make
and
that
goblin
myself.
war.
Weapons are more difficult.
Thorin pondered
soldiers
these
took
words.
everything in
I
the
will keep
village.
this sword in honor.
I will talk to the blacksmith.
Yes,
May it
Felipe
soon
can
cleave
certainly make something
goblins
for you.
once again.
Or Senu can help you find what you
A
need.
wish that is likely to be granted
Senu.
soon enough in the
Senu is alive.
mountains, said Elrond. But show me now your map.
Look who is coming.
He took it and gazed long at it.
Senu,
He shook
God.
his head, for if he did
Fine
not
form.
altogether
Rabia
approve of
has nursed it to
dwarves
health.
and their love
I
of
must
gold,
thank her.
he hated dragons
People are
and their
desperate for your
cruel
help,
wickedness. And he
They'll help you
grieved
if
to
you help
remember
them.
the ruin of the town of Dale.
I understand.
And its merry bells and the burnt banks of the bright river running. The moon was shining in a broad silver crescent. He held up the map, and the white light shone through it. "What is this?" he said. "There are moon letters here, beside the plain runes which say, 5 feet high the door, they walk abreast." What are moon letters?" asked the Hobbit, full of excitement. He loved maps, as I have told you before, and he also liked runes and letters and cunning handwriting, though
I need to
when he
hunt
wrote
for
it
leather.
himself, it was a bit thin and spidery. "Moon letters are rune letters, but you cannot see them," said Elrond, "not when you look straight at them. They can only be seen when the moon shines behind them, and what is more, with the more cunning sword, it must be a moon of the same shape
Fire.
and season as
I
the
need some
day
help
when
with
they
the
were
requests on
written.
my table if you have any time.
The dwarves invented them and wrote them with silver pens, as your friends could tell you. These must have been written on a midsummer's eve in a crescent
freshwater
moon
spring in the
a
Amanai cave.
long while ago.
I know that cave.
"What do they say?"
Better look
asked
into it.
Gandalf and Thorin together, a bit vexed, perhaps, that even Elrond should have found this out
Saruman.
first, though really there had
Not
not
like him
been
to
a
give
chance before, and there would not have been another until goodness knows when. "Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks," read Elrond, "and the setting sun, with the last light of Durin's day, will shine upon the keyhole." Durin, said Thorin. "He was the father of the fathers of the eldest race of dwarves, the Longbeards, and my first ancestor. I am his heir." "Then what is Durin's day?" "The first day of the dwarves' new year," said Thorin. "It is all should know the first day of the last moon of autumn on the threshold of winter. We still call it Durin's day,
when the last moon of autumn and the sun are in the sky together. But this will not help us much, I fear, for it passes our skill in these days to guess when such a time will come again. That remains to be seen, said Gandalf. Is there any more writing? None to be seen by this moon, said Elrond, and he gave the map back to Thorin. And then they went down to the water to see the elves dance and sing upon the Midsummer's Eve. The next morning was a midsummer's morning as fair and fresh as could be dreamt. Blue sky and never a cloud, and the sun dancing on the water. Now they rode away amid songs of farewell and good speed,
Thanks to Nea,
with their hearts
goddess
ready
of hunting.
for more adventure, and with the knowledge of the road they must follow over the misty mountains to the land beyond. Chapter 4. Over Hill and Under Hill. There were many paths that led up into those mountains and many passes over them. But most of the paths were cheats and deceptions and led nowhere or to bad ends. And most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. The dwarves and the Hobbit, helped by the wise advice of Elrond and the knowledge and memory of Gandalf, took the right road to the right pass. Long days after they had climbed out of the valley and left the last homely house miles behind, they were still going up and up and up. It was a hard path and a dangerous path, a crooked way and a lonely and a long. Now they could look back over the lands they had left, laid out behind them, far below, far, far away in the west, where things were blue and faint. Bilbo knew there lay his own country of safe and comfortable things, and his little hobbit hole. He shivered. It was getting bitter cold up here, and the wind came shrill among the rocks. Boulders, too, at times came galloping down the mountainsides, let loose by midday sun upon the snow, and passed among them, which was lucky, or over their heads, which was alarming. The nights were comfortless and chill, and they did not dare to sing or talk too loud, for the echoes were uncanny, and the silence seemed to dislike being broken, except by the noise of water and the wail of wind and the crack of stone. The summer is getting on down below, thought Bilbo, and haymaking is going on and picnics. They will be harvesting and blackberrying before we even begin to go down the other side at this rate. And the others were thinking equally gloomy thoughts, although when they had said goodbye to Elrond in the high hope of a midsummer morning, they had spoken gaily of the passage of the mountains and of riding swift across the lands beyond. They had thought of coming to the secret door in the lonely mountain, perhaps that very next moon of autumn. And perhaps it will be Durin's Day, he had said. Only Gandalf had shaken his head and said nothing. Dwarves had not passed that way for many years, but Gandalf had, and he knew how evil and danger had grown and thriven in the wild, since the dragons had driven men from the lands and the goblins had spread in secret after the Battle of the Mines of Moria. Even the good plans of wise wizards like Gandalf and of good friends like Elrond go astray sometimes when you are off on dangerous adventures over the edge of the wild. And Gandalf was a wise enough wizard to know it. He knew something unexpected might happen, and he hardly dared to hope that they would pass without fearful adventure over those great tall mountains with lonely peaks and valleys where no king ruled. They did not. All was well until one day they met a thunderstorm. More than a thunderstorm, a thunder battle. You know how terrific a really big thunderstorm can be down in the land and in a river valley, especially at times when two great thunderstorms meet and clash. More terrible still are thunder and lightning in the mountains at night, when storms come up from east and west and make war. The lightning splinters on the peaks and rocks shiver, and great crashes split the air and go rolling and tumbling into every cave and hollow.
and the darkness is filled with overwhelming noise and sudden light. Bilbo had never seen or imagined anything of the kind. They were high up in a narrow place with a dreadful fall into a dim valley at one side of them. There they were sheltering under a hanging rock for the night, and he lay beneath a blanket and shook from head to toe. When he peeped out, in the lightning flashes, he saw that across the valley, the stone giants were out and were hurling rocks at one another for a game, and catching them and tossing them down into the darkness, where they smashed among the trees far below, or splintered into little bits with a bang. Then came a wind and a rain, and the wind whipped the rain and the hail about in every direction, so that an overhanging rock was no protection at all. Soon they were getting drenched, and their ponies were standing with their heads down and their tails between their legs, and some of them were whinnying with fright. They could hear the giants guffawing and shouting all over the mountainsides.
"This won't do at all," said Thorin. "If we don't get blown off or drowned or struck by lightning, we shall be picked up by some giant and kicked sky high for a football." "Well, if you know of anywhere better, take us there,"
said Gandalf, who was feeling very grumpy and was far from happy about the giants himself. The end of their argument was that they sent Fili and Kili to look for a better shelter. They had very sharp eyes, and being the youngest of the dwarves by some 50 years, they usually got these sort of jobs, when everybody could see that it was absolutely no use sending Bilbo.
"There is nothing like looking if you want to find something,"
or so Thorin said to the young dwarves. You certainly usually find something if you look, but it is not always quite the something you were after. So it proved on this occasion. Soon, Fili and Kili came crawling back, holding onto the rocks in the wind. We found a dry cave," they said. "Not far round the next corner, and ponies, and all get inside."
"Have you thoroughly explored it?" said the wizard,
who knew that caves up in the mountains were seldom unoccupied. Yes, they said, though everybody knew they could not have been long about it. They had come back too quick. "It isn't all that big, and it does not go far back." That, of course, is the dangerous part about caves. You don't know how far they go back, sometimes, or where a passage behind may lead to, or what is waiting for you inside. But now, Fili and Kili's news seemed good enough, so they all got up and prepared to move. The wind was howling and the thunder still growling, and they had a business getting themselves and their ponies along. Still, it was not very far to go, and before long they came to a big rock standing out into the path. If you stepped behind, you found a low arch in the side of the mountain. There was just room to get the ponies through with a squeeze when they had been unpacked and unsaddled. As they passed under the arch, it was good to hear the wind and the rain outside instead of all about them, and to feel safe from the giants and their rocks. But the wizard was taking no risks.
I will find your brother.
He lit up his wand.
What?
As he did that day in Bilbo's dining room that seemed so long ago, if you
You will
remember.
have to talk to them. Now
And
go
by
ahead.
its light, they explored the cave from end to end. It seemed quite a fair size, but not too large and mysterious. It had a dry floor and some comfortable nooks. At one end there was room for the ponies, and there they stood, mighty glad of the change, steaming and champing in their nose bags. Owen and Glowin wanted to light a fire at the door to dry their clothes, but Gandalf would not hear of it. So they spread out their wet things on the floor and got dry ones out of their bundles. Then they made their blankets comfortable, got out their pipes, and blew smoke rings, which Gandalf turned into different colours and set dancing up by the roof to amuse them. They talked and forgot about the storm, and discussed what each would do with his share of the treasure when they got it, which at the moment did not seem so impossible. And so they dropped off to sleep one by one, and that was the last time that they used
Chancelas, stay there. Coming
baggages,
to get you.
tools, and paraphernalia that they had brought with them. It turned out a good thing that night that they had brought little Bilbo with them after all. For somehow he could not go to sleep for a long while, and when he did sleep, he had very nasty dreams. He dreamt that a crack in the wall at the back of the cave got bigger and bigger and opened wider and wider, and he was very afraid but could not call out or do anything but lie and look. Then he dreamt that the floor of the cave was giving way,
How did
and he
Chancellor
was
get through
slipping,
here?
beginning to fall down, goodness knows where to. At that, he woke up with a horrible start and found that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened at the back of the cave and was already a wide passage. He was just in time to see the last of the pony's tails disappearing into it. Of course, he gave a very loud yell, as loud a yell as a hobbit can give, which is surprising for their size. Out jumped the goblins. Big goblins, great, ugly-looking goblins, lots of goblins before you could say rocks and blocks. There were 6 to each dwarf at least, and 2 even for Bilbo, and they were all grabbed and carried through the crack before you could say tinder and flint. But not Gandalf.
Let's get you out of
Bilbo's yell had done that much good. It had wakened him up wide in a splintered second, and when goblins came to grab him, there was a terrific flash like lightning in the cave, a smell like gunpowder, and several of them fell dead. The crack closed with a snap, and Bilbo and the dwarves were on the wrong side of it. Where was Gandalf? Of that, neither they nor the goblins had any idea, and the goblins did not wait to find out. They seized Bilbo and the dwarves and hurried them along. It was deep, deep dark, such as only goblins that have taken to living in the heart of the mountains can see through. The passages there were crossed and tangled in all directions, but the goblins knew their way as well as you do to the nearest post office. And the way went down and down, and it was most horribly stuffy. The goblins were very rough and pinched unmercifully, and chuckled and laughed in their horrible, stony voices, and Bilbo was more unhappy even than when the troll had picked him up by his toes. He wished again and again for his nice bright hobbit hole, and not for the last time. Now, there came a glimmer of red light before them. The goblins began to sing or croak, keeping time with a flap and their flat feet on the stone and shaking their prisoners as well.
Clap, snap, the black, crack, grip, grab, pinch, nab, and down, down to Goblin Town you go, my lad. Clash, crash, crush, smash, hammer and tongs, knocker and gongs, pound, pound, far underground, ho, ho, my lad. Swish, smack, whip, crack, batter and beat, yammer and bleat, work, work, nor dare to shirk, while goblins quaff, and goblins laugh, round and round, far underground below, my lad.
It sounded truly terrifying. The walls echoed to the clap, snap, and the crush, smash, and to the ugly laughter of their ho-ho, my lad. The general meaning of the song was only too plain, for now the goblins took out whips and whipped them with a swish, smack, and set them running as fast as they could in front of them. And more than one of the dwarfs were already yammering and bleating like anything when they stumbled into a big cavern. It was lit by a great red fire in the middle and by torches along the walls, and it was full of goblins. They all laughed and stamped and clapped their hands when the dwarves, with poor Bilbo at the back nearest to the whips, came running in while the goblin drivers whooped and cracked their whips behind. The ponies were already there, huddled in a corner, and there all the packages lying broken open and being rummaged by goblins and smelt by goblins and fingered by goblins and quarreled over by goblins. I'm afraid that was the last they ever saw of those excellent Bilbos, including a jolly sturdy little white fellow that Elrond had lent to Gandalf since his horse was not suitable for the mountain paths. For goblins, horses and ponies and donkeys and other much more dreadful things. And they are always hungry.
Go on.
Just now, however, the prisoners were thinking only of themselves. The goblins chained their hands behind their backs and linked them all together in a line and dragged them to the far end of the cavern, with little Bilbo tugging at the end of the rope. There, in the shadows on a large flat stone, sat a tremendous goblin with a huge head and armed goblins were standing round him carrying the axes and the bent swords that they use. Now, goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves, when they take the trouble, though they are usually untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture they make very well, or get others to make to their design, prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once. For wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days and those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the orderly and prosperous. In some parts, wicked dwarves had even made alliances with them. But they had a special grudge against Thorin's people because of the war which you have heard mentioned, but which does not come into this tale. And anyway, goblins don't care who they catch, as long as it is done smart and secret, and the prisoners are not able to defend themselves.
Who are these miserable persons? Said the great goblin. Dwarves, and this, said one of the drivers, pulling at Bilbo's chain so that he fell forward onto his knees. We found them sheltering in our front porch.
What do you mean by it? Said the great goblin, turning to Thorin.
Up to no good, I'll warrant. Spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I shouldn't be surprised to learn. Murderers and friends of elves, not unlikely. Come, what have you got to say?
Thorin, the dwarf at your service, he replied. It was merely a polite nothing.
Of the things which you suspect and imagine, we had no idea at all. We sheltered from a storm in what seemed a convenient cave and unused. Nothing was further from our thoughts than inconveniencing goblins in any way whatever. That was true enough.
Said the great goblin. So you say. Might I ask what you were doing up in the mountains at all? And where you were coming from, and where you were going to? In fact, I should like to know all about you. Not that it will do you much good, Thorin Oakenshield. I know too much about your folk already. But let's have the truth, or I will prepare something particularly uncomfortable for you.
We were on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews and nieces, and first, second, and third cousins, and the other descendants of our grandfathers who live on the east side of these truly hospitable mountains, said Thorin, not quite knowing what to say all at once in a moment, when obviously the exact truth would not do at all.
He is a liar, oh truly tremendous one, said one of the drivers. Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave when we invited these creatures to come below, and they are as dead as stones. Also, he has not explained this.
He held out the sword which Thorin wore, the sword which came from the troll's lair. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clashed their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time, when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did battle before their walls. They had called it Orcrist, Goblin Cleaver, but the goblins called it simply
Biter.
They hated it, and hated worse anyone who carried it.
Murderers and elf friends,
the great goblin shouted. Slash 'em, beat 'em, bite 'em, gnash 'em. Take 'em away to dark holes full of snakes and never let them see the light again. He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat and himself rushed at Thorin with his mouth open. Just at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out and the great fire went off, poof, into a tower of blue, glowing smoke right up to the roof that scattered piercing white sparks all among the goblins. The yells and yammering, croaking, gibbering and jabbering, howls, growls and curses, shrieking and skriking that followed were beyond description. Several hundred wild cats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would not have compared with it. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell from the roof made the air thick for even their eyes to see through. Soon they were falling over one another and rolling in heaps on the floor, biting and kicking and fighting as if they had all gone mad. Suddenly a sword flashed in its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin as he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage. He fell dead, and the goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. The sword went back into its sheath. "Follow me, quick!" said a voice, fierce and quiet, and before Bilbo understood what had happened, he was trotting along again as fast as he could trot at the end of the line, down more dark passages with the yells of the goblin hall growing fainter behind him. A pale light was leading them on. "Quicker! Quicker!" said the voice. "The torches will soon be relit." "Half a minute," said Dory, who was at the back, next to Bilbo and a decent fellow. He made the hobbit scramble on his shoulders as best he could with his tied hands, and then off they all went at a run, with a clink-clink of chains and many a stumble, since they had no hands to steady themselves with. Not for a long while did they stop, and by that time they must have been right down in the very mountain's heart. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf, but just then they were too busy to ask how he got there. He took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with a rage that made it gleam if goblins were about. Now it was bright as blue flame for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatever of cutting through the goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. The sword's name was Glamdring the Foehammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it Beater, and hated it worse than Biter, if possible. Orcus, too, had been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it from one of the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, and though he could not do everything, he could do a great deal for friends in a tight corner. "Are we all here?" said he, handing his sword back to Thorin with a bow. "Let me see. 1, that's Thorin. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where are Philly and Killy? Here they are. 12, 13. And here's Mr. Baggins. 14. Well, it might be worse. And then again, it might be a good deal better. No ponies and no food, and no knowing quite where we are, and hordes of angry goblins just behind. On we go!" On they went. Gandalf was quite right. They began to hear goblin noises and horrible cries far behind in the passages they had come through. That sent them on faster than ever, and as poor Bilbo could not possibly go half as fast, for dwarves can roll along at a tremendous pace, I can tell you, when they have to, they took it in turn to carry him on their backs. Still, goblins go faster than dwarves, and these goblins knew the way better. They had made the paths themselves, and were madly angry. So that do what they could, the dwarves heard the cries and howls getting closer and closer. Soon they could hear even the flap of the goblin feet, many, many feet which seemed only just round the last corner. The blink of red torches could be seen behind them in the tunnel they were following, and they were getting deadly tired. "Why, oh why, did I ever leave my hobbit hole?" said poor Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Bomber's back. "Why, oh why did I ever bring a wretched little hobbit on a treasure hunt?" said poor Bomber, who was fat and staggered along with the sweat dripping down his nose in his heat and terror. At this point, Gandalf fell behind, and Thorin with him. They turned a sharp corner. About turn, he shouted. Draw your sword, Thorin.
There was nothing else to be done, and the goblins did not like it. They came scurrying round the corner in full cry and found Goblin Cleaver and Foe Hammer shining cold and bright right in their astonished eyes. The ones in front dropped their torches and gave one yell before they were killed. The ones behind yelled still more and leapt back, knocking over those that were running after them.
Bite her and beat her!
They shrieked, and soon they were all in confusion, and most of them were hustling back the way they had come. It was quite a long while before any of them dared to turn that corner. By that time the dwarves had gone on again, a long, long way on into the dark tunnels of the goblins' realm. When the goblins discovered that, they put out their torches and they slipped on soft shoes, and they chose out their very quickest runners with the sharpest ears and eyes. These ran forward as swift as weasels in the dark, and with hardly any more noise than bats. That is why neither Bilbo, nor the dwarves, nor even Gandalf heard them coming. Nor did they see them, but they were seen by the goblins that ran silently up behind. For Gandalf was letting his wand give out a faint light to help the dwarves as they went along. Quite suddenly, Dorry, now at the back again carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark. He shouted and fell, and the hobbit rolled off his shoulders into the blackness, bumped his head on a hard rock, and remembered nothing more.